The shift begins. Alice Turner adjusted her name badge as she clocked into her evening shift at the local grocery store. The scent of fresh produce mingled with the faint aroma of cleaning supplies, creating the familiar ambience of her workplace. She smiled at a regular customer, an elderly woman named Mrs. Callahan, who always came in for her favorite chamomile tea and a chat. The routine was comforting, but tonight felt different. There was a tension she couldn't quite place. As Alice greeted customers with her practiced cheer, she found her mind wandering to her husband, Jim. He had been away on a short training mission, but was due home tonight. The thought of him walking through their front door, his strong arms wrapping around her, brought a small smile to her face. Jim, a paratrooper, was her rock, a steady presence in a life often filled with challenges. The store was moderately busy, with a steady stream of customers coming and going. Alice managed the register efficiently, her movements automatic as she scanned items and exchanged polite pleasantries. She didn't notice the group of bikers until they entered the store, their heavy boots echoing against the tile floor. There were 4 of them, dressed in worn leather jackets and denim. Their presence was impossible to ignore. Loud laughter, crude jokes, and an air of defiance that seemed to demand attention. The leader, Jake, stood out immediately. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a cocky swagger that made Alice uneasy. His companions, Mitch, Troy, and Zeke, followed close behind, each adding their own brand of intimidation to the mix. Alice kept her head down, focusing on her work, but her heart began to race. She could feel their eyes on her, a weight that made her skin crawl. "Hey there, sweetheart," Jake called out, his voice dripping with mockery as he sauntered up to her register. "What's a pretty thing like you doing in a place like this?" Alice glanced up, forcing a polite smile. "Just doing my job, sir. Can I help you find anything?" Jake leaned against the counter, his smirk widening. "Oh, I think we found exactly what we're looking for." The men laughed, their voices loud and grating. Mitch stepped closer, his eyes raking over Alice with a lewd grin. "You know, you'd be way better off hanging out with us instead of standing here all night. What do you say?" Alice's grip on the counter tightened as she fought to keep her composure. "I'm sorry, but I need to get back to work. If you're not buying anything, I'll have to ask you to move along." "Move along?" Troy repeated with a sneer. "We're customers, aren't we? We've got every right to be here." Alice's heart pounded as Zeke leaned in, his grin malevolent. "Yeah, darling, maybe you could show us some special customer service." Her stomach churned, but she maintained her professionalism. "Please don't make this difficult. There are other customers waiting." Jake's smirk faded, replaced by a more menacing expression. "You're awful feisty for someone working minimum wage. Don't forget your place." Alice clenched her jaw, refusing to let them see how much they were rattling her. She scanned the room, hoping to catch the eye of a coworker or the store manager, but everyone else seemed oblivious to the escalating tension. As the bikers continued their taunts, Alice's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stole a quick glance at the screen. It was a message from Jim. "Heading home soon. Love you." Her fingers hovered over the reply button, but she hesitated. She didn't want to worry him unnecessarily. Instead, she focused on the elderly customer approaching her register. Alice greeted her with a strained smile, trying to shield the woman from the brewing storm. But the bikers didn't care about the presence of other customers. Jake reached across the counter, his hand brushing too close for comfort. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his tone low and insistent. "We're just having some fun. No need to be so uptight." Alice stepped back, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Please, stop." The older woman in line frowned, glancing between Alice and the bikers. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked gently. Alice nodded quickly, not wanting to escalate the situation further. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be with you in just a moment." Jake rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll wait." But the way he and his friends exchanged smirks made it clear they weren't done. Alice finished ringing up the elderly woman's items as quickly as she could, her hands shaking slightly. The woman leaned in as she gathered her bags. "You need help, dear," she whispered. Alice forced a smile. "I'll be okay. Thank you." As the woman left, the bikers resumed their taunts, louder and more aggressive than before. Alice's eyes darted toward the entrance, silently willing Jim to arrive. She knew he'd protect her, but she also didn't want him walking into a dangerous situation. Just as she felt her resolve weakening, the door swung open and Jim stepped inside. His military uniform was crisp and imposing, a stark contrast to the casual atmosphere of the grocery store. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes immediately locking onto Alice and the bikers. Everything seemed to pause as Jim approached the register, his presence commanding and unyielding. The bikers froze, their bravado faltering under his intense gaze. "Is there a problem here?" Jim asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. Jake straightened, trying to regain his composure. "Who's asking?" Jim's expression hardened, his posture unwavering. "I am. I'm her husband." The tension in the room thickened as the bikers sized him up, clearly debating their next move. Alice felt a surge of relief and fear all at once. Jim was here, but she knew this wasn't over yet. Jake sneered, his confidence wavering. "Big man in a uniform. What are you gonna do, soldier boy?" Jim's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "You don't want to find out." For the first time that evening, Alice felt a flicker of hope. Jim wasn't just her husband. He was her protector, her partner, and a force to be reckoned with. She stepped closer to him, drawing strength from his presence. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado now tempered with caution. They might have come looking for trouble, but they hadn't expected to find someone like Jim. And Alice knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. A storm brewing. The bikers didn't back off immediately. Jake's lips curled into a mocking sneer as he leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "Husband, huh?" he drawled, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Well, sweetheart, you could have done better." Jim's eyes didn't waver, his sharp, unflinching gaze locked onto Jake. "You've got two choices," Jim said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Leave now, or we make this conversation a lot less polite." The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to feel oppressive. Alice's pulse raced as she watched the scene unfold. She wanted to intervene, to tell Jim not to escalate things, but she knew better than to step between him and a threat. Jim wasn't the kind to provoke a fight, but he also wasn't one to walk away from one when the stakes were personal. Troy shifted uneasily, the large man looking more uncomfortable by the second. "Maybe we should head out, Jake," he muttered under his breath. But Jake wasn't ready to back down. His pride, bruised by Jim's steady resolve, refused to let him walk away quietly. He stepped forward, invading Jim's space with a forced swagger. "What are you gonna do, tough guy? Call the cops. You're just a grocery store hero." Jim's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, amplifying the tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, calm, and terrifying in its certainty. "You don't want to test me." The store was unusually quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound breaking the stillness. Customers lingered at the edges, their nervous glances darting between the bikers and Jim. Alice caught sight of a coworker peeking out from behind the stockroom door, clearly hesitant to get involved. Mitch, sensing the growing unease among the group, tried to lighten the mood with a forced laugh. "Come on, Jake. Let's not waste our time here. She's just a cashier and he's, what? A soldier on leave. Nothing worth getting into trouble over." Jake's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but his bravado wouldn't let him fully retreat. "You're lucky," he spat, pointing a finger at Jim. "If you weren't here." Jim took a deliberate step forward, cutting him off. "But I am here," he said, his voice sharp and final. "So get out." For a long moment, it seemed like Jake might push further, but Zeke grabbed his arm. "Jake, man, let it go. It's not worth it." Jake hesitated, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Anger, humiliation, and a grudging acknowledgement of Jim's authority. Finally, he huffed a bitter laugh and turned to leave. "This isn't over," he muttered as he shoved past Zeke and Troy, heading for the exit. The other bikers followed, their earlier bravado replaced by tension and frustration. Mitch shot Alice one last glance, his smirk forced and hollow. "See you around, sweetheart," he said, but the words lacked their earlier menace. As the doors swung shut behind them, the store seemed to exhale collectively. The murmurs of customers picking up their shopping resumed, and the tension began to dissipate. But for Alice, the adrenaline still coursed through her veins, leaving her trembling. Jim turned to her, his expression softening as his eyes met hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and filled with concern. Alice nodded, but her voice wavered as she spoke. "I am now. Thank you." He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You shouldn't have to deal with that. Ever." Alice smiled weakly, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "I didn't know if they were going to leave," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared." Jim's jaw clenched at her words, the protective instinct flaring in his eyes. "They won't bother you again. Not if I have anything to say about it." But even as he said the words, Alice couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. Jake's parting words echoed in her mind, a lingering threat that refused to fade. Jim noticed her hesitation and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to worry about them. They're just bullies. The moment someone stands up to them, they'd fold." Alice nodded again, trying to believe him. But as she glanced toward the store's entrance, half expecting to see the bikers lurking outside, she knew she wouldn't feel completely safe until she was home with Jim by her side. The rest of her shift passed uneventfully, though she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder every few minutes. Jim stayed close, his presence a constant comfort as he quietly observed the store. He made small talk with customers, his calm demeanor putting others at ease, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room. When Alice's shift finally ended, she let out a sigh of relief. Jim was waiting for her by the door, his protective stance still in place. "Ready to go?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, slipping her arm through his. "More than ready." As they stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her face, bringing a momentary sense of calm. But as they walked to the car, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on them. She glanced around nervously, but the parking lot was quiet. Jim noticed her unease and stopped, turning to face her. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Probably nothing. Just nerves." Jim's expression softened, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You've been through a lot tonight. Let's get home." Alice nodded, letting him guide her to the car. But as they drove away, she couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bikers following them. The parking lot remained empty, but the tension in her chest refused to ease. At home, Jim made her a cup of tea and sat with her on the couch, his presence a steady anchor. They talked about their day, the mundane details providing a welcome distraction. But as the hours passed and the house grew quiet, Alice found herself replaying the confrontation in her mind. The bikers were gone, but their threat lingered like a dark cloud. And deep down, Alice knew this wasn't the end. Shadows of retribution. The following day began quietly. The sun filtered through the kitchen window as Alice sipped her morning coffee, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening. Jim sat across from her, scrolling through his phone, his presence as steadying as the aroma of the coffee filling the room. For a moment, life felt normal again. "You slept okay?" Jim asked, breaking the silence. Alice nodded, though the truth was more complicated. "Better than I thought I would," she said, managing a small smile. She didn't want to burden him with the vivid nightmares that had visited her. The bikers' sneering faces, their mocking voices, and a looming sense of helplessness. Jim studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes not missing a thing. "You're strong, Alice," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "But if you need to talk about anything, I'm here." "I know," she replied, her voice soft with gratitude. "Thank you." The day progressed uneventfully, but Alice couldn't shake the unease clinging to her. She had to return to the grocery store for another evening shift, and while Jim had promised to pick her up again, the thought of facing the bikers, or anyone like them, made her stomach churn. As she stepped into the store that evening, the familiar hum of the overhead lights greeted her. She forced herself to focus on the routine, scanning items, greeting customers, and stocking shelves when the lines thinned. The monotony was oddly comforting, a reminder that life could still be normal. But as the hours ticked by, her anxiety began to creep back. Her eyes flicked to the entrance every few minutes, half expecting Jake and his gang to swagger through the doors. The store manager, Mr. Fenton, had noticed her distracted state and approached her during a lull. "You all right, Alice?" he asked, his tone kind but concerned. "You seem a little on edge." "I'm fine," Alice replied quickly, not wanting to draw attention to herself. "Just a long night." Mr. Fenton nodded but lingered for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful. "If anything's wrong, you let me know. We take care of our own here." Alice smiled weakly. "Thanks, Mr. Fenton. I appreciate it." As the evening wore on, Alice began to relax slightly. Maybe the bikers had moved on, she told herself. Maybe last night was just a fleeting moment of trouble. But as her shift neared its end, the familiar roar of motorcycle engines shattered her fragile sense of calm. Her stomach dropped as she glanced out the front window. 3 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their headlights slicing through the darkness. The riders dismounted, their silhouettes unmistakable. Jake, Mitch, and Zeke. Troy was absent, but that didn't make their presence any less intimidating. Alice's breath quickened as she instinctively reached for her phone, dialing Jim's number. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Alice," he said, his voice immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jake and the others. They're outside." "I'm on my way," Jim said without hesitation. "Stay inside, stay near people, and don't engage with them. I'll be there soon." Alice nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay. Please hurry." As she hung up, the bikers entered the store, their boots echoing ominously against the tile floor. Jake's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Alice. His lips curved into a slow, predatory grin as he strode toward her. "Well, look who it is," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby customers. "Miss Attitude. Didn't think you'd see us again, did you?" Alice swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm working," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If you're not buying anything, you need to leave." Jake chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You've got some nerves, sweetheart. Telling me what to do again. Didn't your husband teach you better manners?" The other 2 laughed, their voices harsh and mocking. Mitch leaned against a nearby display of canned goods, his eyes roaming over Alice in a way that made her skin crawl. "Maybe we should teach her some manners ourselves," he said, his tone dripping with malice. The customers in the store began to murmur, their unease evident. Mr. Fenton appeared from the back, his expression darkening as he assessed the situation. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice firm. Jake turned to him, his grin widening. "No problem, old man. Just saying hi to our friend here." "She's not your friend," Mr. Fenton said, stepping closer. "And if you're here to cause trouble, I'll have to ask you to leave." Jake's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Relax. We're paying customers, aren't we? Just here to grab a few things." Alice's heart raced as she glanced at the entrance, praying for Jim to appear. She could still hear the low rumble of motorcycles outside, a constant reminder of the danger looming. Minutes felt like hours as the bikers continued to linger, their taunts and lewd comments drawing the attention of everyone in the store. Alice's coworkers stood frozen, unsure of how to intervene. Mr. Fenton tried to maintain control, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Finally, the store's doors swung open, and Jim entered. He was dressed in plain clothes this time, but his presence was no less commanding. His eyes immediately locked onto Alice, then shifted to the bikers. Jake noticed him too, his expression hardening. "Well, well," he said, straightening. "Look who decided to show up." Jim didn't respond immediately. He walked toward Alice, his posture calm but purposeful. When he reached her side, he turned to face Jake, his expression unreadable. "You were told to leave her alone," Jim said, his voice low but firm. Jake scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "And who's gonna make us?" "You? I don't see that uniform tonight. Soldier boy." Jim took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I don't need a uniform to deal with people like you." The tension in the store reached its breaking point as the two men stared each other down. Customers began to quietly retreat, and even Mr. Fenton looked uneasy. But Jim didn't waver, his unwavering presence a stark contrast to Jake's bravado. Alice felt a surge of hope as she watched her husband confront the bikers. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: Jim wouldn't back down. Not for her, not for anyone. The line is crossed. The air inside the grocery store was thick with tension, every pair of eyes trained on the confrontation unfolding between Jim and Jake. For a moment, no one moved. The bikers, their earlier arrogance now tempered by uncertainty, exchanged uneasy glances. Jake's sneer faltered as Jim's calm yet unyielding stance became impossible to ignore. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Jake said, his voice carrying less bravado than he intended. He took a half-step forward, his posture still aggressive, but lacking the confidence he'd exuded before. Jim didn't flinch. His tone remained steady, his voice a quiet warning. "I gave you a chance to walk away yesterday. You should have taken it." Zeke, standing behind Jake, snorted. "What are you gonna do, tough guy? We're not scared of you." Jim's sharp gaze flicked to Zeke, and the biker instinctively took a step back. The authority in Jim's eyes wasn't something that could be faked. It was the mark of someone who had faced far greater challenges than a few bullies in a grocery store. Alice, standing behind the counter, felt her heart pounding in her chest. She gripped the edge of the counter tightly, her knuckles turning white. She didn't want this to escalate, but she also knew there was no reasoning with men like Jake and his crew. Her faith in Jim was unshakable, but that didn't ease her fear. Jake's lips curled into a forced smirk. "You're real brave when you're playing hero in front of your wife. But I'm guessing you're all talk." Jim took another step forward, his calm demeanor unchanging. "This isn't about being brave, and it's not about talk. It's about making sure my wife can do her job without being harassed. Now this is your last chance. Leave, or I make you leave." The challenge hung in the air, the weight of Jim's words settling heavily over the room. Customers had stopped pretending to shop and were openly watching the scene. A few pulled out their phones, recording the encounter. Mr. Fenton stood near the stockroom door, his phone in hand, ready to call the police if necessary. Jake's smirk disappeared entirely. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it was clear he didn't know how to handle it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his pride refusing to let him walk away. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice harder now. "Maybe you should be the one walking away." Jim's eyes narrowed, and he took another step closer, closing the distance between them. His voice was low but carried an unmistakable warning. "This is the last time I'm going to say it. Leave. Now." The silence that followed was deafening. Mitch shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado gone. Zeke glanced at the door, as if calculating the odds of making a quick escape. Jake, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. He lunged forward, shoving Jim in the chest. It was a mistake. Jim didn't stagger or stumble. Instead, he stood his ground, his expression hardening as he caught Jake's wrist in an iron grip. In one fluid motion, he twisted Jake's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The bikers froze, their faces a mix of shock and hesitation. "Enough," Jim said, his voice firm but composed. "This ends here." Jake struggled against Jim's hold, but it was clear he was outmatched. "Let me go," he barked, his voice strained with a mix of pain and frustration. "I'll let you go," Jim said, his tone calm but resolute. "As soon as you and your friends leave, and never come back." Zeke and Mitch exchanged a glance, unsure of what to do. Finally, Zeke stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "All right, man. We'll go. Just let him up." Jim glanced at Alice, who gave him a small nod. Reluctantly, he released Jake, who scrambled to his feet, cradling his arm. His face was flushed with anger and humiliation as he glared at Jim. "This isn't over," he growled. "It is," Jim replied evenly, his gaze never wavering. "Because if I see you near my wife again, you won't get off this easy." The threat wasn't shouted or dramatic, but it carried a weight that made even Jake hesitate. With a muttered curse, Jake gestured for his crew to follow him. Mitch and Zeke didn't argue, hurrying to the door without a backward glance. The roar of their motorcycles echoed in the parking lot as they sped away, leaving the store in tense silence. Slowly, the customers began to move again, murmuring amongst themselves. A few approached Alice, offering words of support and admiration for Jim. Mr. Fenton stepped forward, his expression one of gratitude and relief. "You all right, Alice?" She nodded, her voice shaky but firm. "I'm fine, thanks to Jim." Mr. Fenton turned to Jim, offering his hand. "I appreciate what you did. Not everyone would have stepped in like that." Jim shook his hand but said nothing, his focus remaining on Alice. He stepped closer to her, his hand gently brushing her arm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Alice managed a weak smile, the adrenaline beginning to wear off. "I am now. Thank you." Jim nodded, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of lingering fear or distress. Satisfied that she was all right, he took her hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's get you home." As they left the store together, Alice felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. Jim had diffused the situation, but Jake's parting words echoed in her mind. She knew the bikers wouldn't let this go, and while she trusted Jim implicitly, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The retaliation. The days following the confrontation at the grocery store were a mixed bag of relief and unease for Alice and Jim. The bikers had seemingly disappeared, their absence both a comfort and a cause for suspicion. Alice couldn't shake the lingering fear that Jake and his crew were planning something. The way Jake had looked at her as he left the store, his eyes full of unspoken promises, was enough to make her sleep fitful and her waking hours tense. Jim, ever the rock, did his best to reassure her. He stayed home as much as possible, using his downtime between missions to keep a close eye on things. He checked the locks on the doors and windows, made sure the security cameras around their modest home were working, and even reached out to a few of his military buddies for advice. "I don't think they'll come back," Jim told Alice one evening as they sat on the couch. His arm was draped protectively around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, seeking the comfort his presence always provided. "But if they do, we'll be ready." Alice nodded, trying to let his confidence bolster her own. I hate feeling like this, like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder." Jim kissed the top of her head. "You won't have to for long. They'll move on once they realize we're not easy targets." But as the days passed, Alice's anxiety didn't fully subside. And one quiet evening, as she prepared for bed, her worst fears began to materialize. The first sign of trouble was the sound of motorcycles. Faint at first, The distant rumble barely registered over the sound of the television in the living room. But as the noise grew louder, Alice froze, her heart dropping into her stomach. She rushed to the window, peeking through the curtains to confirm what she already knew. 3 motorcycles were parked just down the street, their riders silhouetted in the glow of the streetlights. Even at a distance, Alice recognized them: Jake, Mitch, and Zeke. Her breath hitched as she watched them dismount and begin walking toward the house. "Jim," she called out, her voice trembling. He was in the kitchen, his expression instantly alert as he came to her side. "What is it?" "They're here," Alice whispered, pointing toward the bikers. "They're outside." Jim's eyes narrowed as he stepped toward the door, his posture tense but controlled. He glanced at the security camera feed on his phone, confirming what Alice had seen. "Stay here," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Lock the door behind me." "Jim, wait." He turned to her, his gaze steady and reassuring. "It's going to be okay. Just trust me." Reluctantly, Alice nodded and locked the door as he stepped outside. Her hands trembled as she watched through the window, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Jim stepped onto the porch, his presence commanding even in the face of the biker's swaggering approach. He didn't bother with pleasantries, his voice cutting through the cool night air like a blade. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." Jake smirked, his hands in his jacket pockets as he stopped a few feet away from the porch. "We're just here to talk," he said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "No need to get all worked up." Jim crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You had your chance to talk at the store. Now, you're trespassing. Leave." Jake's smirk widened as he took a step closer. "Or what? You gonna call the cops? Or maybe you think you can take all 3 of us?" Behind him, Mitch and Zeke chuckled, their laughter low and menacing. But Jim didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, closing the gap between himself and Jake. "You've already pushed your luck once," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't make me remind you why that was a bad idea." For a moment, the bikers hesitated. Jake's bravado flickered, his confidence momentarily shaken by the unwavering force of Jim's presence. But then he sneered, pulling something out of his jacket pocket: a switchblade. The blade gleamed under the streetlight as he flicked it open, holding it up for Jim to see. "Maybe you're the one who needs a reminder," Jake said, his voice hardening. Inside the house, Alice stifled a gasp. Her fingers hovered over her phone, ready to call the police. But she hesitated, torn between following Jim's instructions and her mounting fear. Jim's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked even calmer, his eyes locked onto Jake's as if daring him to make a move. "You really think that's going to help you?" he asked, his tone almost amused. Jake took another step forward, the blade glinting ominously. "I think it'll even the odds." Before Jake could say another word, Jim moved. It happened so quickly that Alice barely registered it. One moment, Jake was standing there with his knife, and the next, he was on the ground, the blade skittering across the pavement. Jim stood over him, his stance controlled and his breathing even, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. Mitch and Zeke froze, their earlier confidence evaporating as they watched their leader sprawled on the ground. "Jake," Mitch barked, taking a step forward, but Jim's sharp glare stopped him in his tracks. "You've got 2 options," Jim said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Pick him up and leave, or I can put the rest of you on the ground too." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly debating whether to cut their losses or risk further humiliation. Finally, Zeke stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "All right, man, we're going. No need to make this worse." He grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him to his feet. Jake glared at Jim, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This isn't over," he spat, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before. "It is," Jim replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And if I see you near my wife again, You'll regret it." Without another word, the bikers retreated, their footsteps echoing down the street as they returned to their motorcycles. Alice watched from the window, her chest tight with a mix of fear and awe. Jim stood on the porch until the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, his posture relaxed but alert. When he finally stepped back inside, Alice rushed to him, her arms wrapping around him tightly. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," Jim said, his tone reassuring as he held her close. "They're not coming back." Alice nodded against his chest, her fear slowly giving way to relief. For the first time in days, she felt safe. But as Jim gently guided her to the couch and promised to stay vigilant, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. The tension builds. Alice clung to Jim's arm as they sat on the couch, the faint hum of the television in the background doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. Jim's hand rubbed slow, comforting circles on her back, but his own tension was palpable. He kept glancing at his phone, likely expecting a message from his military buddies or a report from the security cameras outside. "They'll stay gone," he said quietly, almost as if trying to convince himself as much as her. "Guys like that thrive on fear, and we didn't give them any." Alice nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. "I believe you," she murmured, but her eyes betrayed her lingering doubt. "But I don't trust them. Jake, he's different. There's something dangerous about him." Jim exhaled heavily, his jaw tightening. "I noticed. He's the type who doesn't like losing control. That makes him unpredictable." Alice shivered at the thought. Jake's piercing glare and the way his lips curled into that sneer flashed in her mind. She couldn't forget the way he had looked at her, as if she was a possession he could claim. "What if they come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jim's gaze softened, and he cupped her face gently. "If they do, they'll regret it. I promise you, Alice, I won't let them hurt you." She nodded again, leaning into his touch. His strength was reassuring, but the fear gnawed at her regardless. "I just want things to go back to normal." "They will," Jim assured her, though his eyes carried a flicker of uncertainty that he quickly masked. "For now, let's stay vigilant. If anything happens, we'll be ready." The next few days passed uneventfully, but the shadow of that night lingered. Alice returned to work, her coworkers offering quiet support and a few concerned questions. The store manager, Mr. Fenton, had hired a security guard, a middle-aged man named Frank who seemed friendly enough, but clearly lacked Jim's commanding presence. Alice appreciated the effort, though it did little to ease her nerves. She couldn't help but glance at the entrance every few minutes, half expecting Jake and his gang to burst in. Her focus wavered, and customers had to repeat themselves more than once as she struggled to stay present. Jim, meanwhile, stayed busy at home. He upgraded their security system, adding motion detectors and extra cameras around the house. He also reached out to a local police officer he knew from his military connections, explaining the situation and ensuring there was a report on file. "They'll know we're not messing around," Jim told Alice one evening as they sat down for dinner. "Jake and his crew aren't stupid. They know they'll be under the radar if they try anything else." But even as he said it, Alice could see the tension in his shoulders. He was trying to reassure her, but deep down, she knew he wasn't entirely convinced. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Alice was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when the motion detectors outside the house activated. The sharp ping from Jim's phone made them both freeze. Jim grabbed the device, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the live camera feed. "They're back," he said grimly. Alice's heart sank. "Are you sure?" Jim turned the phone toward her. On the screen, she could see the same 3 motorcycles parked just outside the perimeter of their property. The riders were milling around, their movements casual but deliberate. Jake stood near the gate, his posture confident and infuriatingly smug. Jim pocketed the phone and grabbed the baseball bat he had leaned against the wall, a precaution he'd kept nearby since the first confrontation. "Stay inside," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alice's stomach churned as she watched him head for the door. "Be careful," she whispered. Jim paused, looking back at her with a soft smile. "Always." The night was eerily quiet as Jim stepped onto the porch. The bikers were clearly waiting for him, their expressions a mix of amusement and challenge. Jake leaned against the gate, his arms crossed, while Mitch and Zeke stood off to the side, their body language more uncertain. "You're persistent," Jim said, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "I'll give you that." Jake grinned, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "What can I say? I'm a man who likes to finish what he starts." Jim's grip tightened on the bat. "You've got one chance to leave before this gets ugly." Jake laughed, a sound that sent a shiver down Alice's spine as she watched from the window. "Oh, we're way past warnings, tough guy." Mitch stepped forward, clearly emboldened by Jake's confidence. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Protecting the little lady inside like it's a movie." Jim's eyes flicked to Mitch, his gaze sharp enough to make the man falter slightly. "This isn't a movie," Jim said evenly, "and I'm not playing a role. But if you think I'm going to let you threaten my wife, you've got another thing coming." Jake's grin widened, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, something malicious. "We're not here to hurt anyone. Just wanted to remind you that you don't own this town. Maybe it's time someone knocked you off that pedestal." Jim's jaw clenched, his body radiating controlled tension. "You've made your point. Now leave." Jake didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket, and Alice's breath caught as she saw him pull out a small object, a lighter. He flicked it open, the tiny flame casting an ominous glow. "We'll leave," Jake said, his tone suddenly cold. "But not before we leave our mark." With that, he tossed the lighter toward the bushes lining the driveway. Alice's eyes widened as she realized what he'd done. The dry branches caught immediately, flames licking hungrily at the foliage. Jim didn't hesitate. He dropped the bat and grabbed the garden hose, turning the water on full blast as he aimed it at the growing fire. Alice rushed outside, her fear overridden by the urgency of the situation. "Call 911," Jim shouted, his voice commanding but calm. Alice fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. The bikers laughed as they mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life. "This isn't over, soldier boy," Jake called over his shoulder as they sped off into the night. By the time the fire was out, the damage was minimal, but the message was clear. Jake wasn't backing down, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the police arrived to take a report, Alice and Jim stood side by side, their resolve unspoken but unbreakable. "They wanted to scare us," Alice said quietly, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. Jim placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression hard but determined. "They underestimated us," he replied. "This ends now, one way or another." The final stand. The fire had been extinguished, but the flames it ignited in Jim and Alice's resolve burned brighter than ever. That night, neither of them slept. Jim sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on his phone as he went over the security footage again and again. Alice, though exhausted, paced the living room, her nerves too frayed to let her sit still. "This has to stop," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "They can't keep doing this. We can't keep living like this." Jim looked up at her, his expression hard but calm. "It will stop," he said firmly. "I'm not letting them push us any further." Alice stopped pacing and turned to face him. "What are we going to do? The police took a report, but you saw how they acted. They said there's no proof Jake started the fire, and even if there was, it's just a misdemeanor. He'll get a slap on the wrist." Jim's jaw tightened. "If the system won't stop them, I will." Alice's heart clenched at the determination in his voice. "Jim, I don't want you to do something that'll get you in trouble." "I'm not looking for trouble," he assured her, "but I'm not going to sit back and wait for them to come after us again. I have to take control of this. She nodded reluctantly, trusting him even as fear gnawed at her. Jim had always been her protector, her unwavering shield, but this situation felt different. The stakes were higher, and the enemy was relentless. The next day, Jim called a few of his military friends, men he trusted with his life. Within hours, 2 of them arrived. Marcus, a burly former Marine with a no-nonsense attitude, and Sam, a quiet but resourceful tech expert who had served alongside Jim in countless missions. They didn't ask for details. They simply listened as Jim explained the situation. "They're testing us," Jim said, pacing the living room as Marcus and Sam sat on the couch. "They think they can intimidate us into submission. We need to show them they're wrong." Marcus nodded, his broad shoulders stiff with tension. "What's the plan?" "Sam, I need you to dig into these guys," Jim said. "Find out who they are, where they hang out, and what they've been up to. If they've crossed any legal lines, I want to know." Sam pulled out his laptop and got to work without a word. "And us?" Marcus asked, cracking his knuckles. "We're going to make sure Alice is safe," Jim replied. "And then we're going to send a message of our own." Alice, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Jim, what does that mean? What are you going to do?" Jim met her gaze, his expression softening. "We're going to make sure they know we're not afraid of them, that this ends here and now." By evening, Sam had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Jake and his crew. The bikers weren't just local troublemakers. They were part of a larger gang with a reputation for extortion, intimidation, and small-time crimes. Jake was the ringleader of their local chapter, using fear and violence to maintain control. "They have a clubhouse on the edge of town," Sam said, showing Jim and Marcus the satellite images on his laptop. "It's where they keep their bikes and do their business. If you want to send a message, that's the place to do it." Jim nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. "Good work. Marcus and I will pay them a visit." Alice's stomach dropped. "You're going to their clubhouse. Jim, that's dangerous." "It's the only way to end this," Jim said gently. "If we let them keep coming after us, they'll never stop. But if we hit them where it hurts, they'll think twice." Alice wanted to argue, but the determination in Jim's eyes stopped her. She knew he was right. The bikers wouldn't stop unless they were forced to. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise," Jim said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'll come back to you." That night, Jim and Marcus drove to the outskirts of town in a nondescript pickup truck. The clubhouse was a dilapidated warehouse surrounded by motorcycles and dimly lit by a few flickering floodlights. Sam had hacked into the security cameras, feeding Jim a live view of the area on his phone. "There are 5 of them inside," Sam said through the earpiece Jim wore. "Jake, Mitch, Zeke, and 2 others." "Perfect," Jim muttered. He and Marcus donned black hoodies to blend into the shadows, their movements precise and quiet as they approached the building. Inside, the bikers were laughing and drinking, their voices echoing through the warehouse. Jake sat at the center of the group, his cocky demeanor on full display. He raised a beer bottle, toasting to their so-called victory. "To teaching that soldier boy a lesson," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Jim and Marcus moved swiftly. Marcus cut the power, plunging the warehouse into darkness, while Jim disabled the bikers' motorcycles by removing critical components from their engines. The chaos inside was immediate. Shouts of confusion and anger echoed through the building as the bikers scrambled to figure out what was happening. Jake's voice rose above the others. "Who the hell is out there?" Jim didn't answer. He and Marcus stayed in the shadows, their movements deliberate as they planted evidence that would link the bikers to illegal activities Sam had uncovered. Drug paraphernalia, counterfeit cash, and stolen goods, all conveniently found in the clubhouse when the authorities would arrive. Finally, Jim stepped into the dim light of the emergency exit sign, his silhouette unmistakable. "You wanted to finish this, Jake," he called out, his voice cold and steady. "Here I am." Jake froze, his bravado slipping as he recognized the figure standing before him. "You've got guts coming here," he snarled, trying to mask his fear. "But you're outnumbered." Jim smirked, gesturing toward the disabled motorcycles. "Outnumbered? Maybe, but not outmatched." Marcus stepped into view, his imposing figure adding to the intimidation. "We're not here to fight," Jim said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "We're here to make sure you understand this. If you come near my family again, it'll be the last mistake you ever make." Jake glared at him, but the fire in his eyes was tempered by uncertainty. He knew he was beaten, even if he didn't want to admit it. "You think you're untouchable." Jake spat. "This isn't over." Jim took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "Yes, it is. The cops will be here in 15 minutes. By the time they're done with you, you'll wish you'd left us alone." Jake's face twisted in anger, but he said nothing as Jim and Marcus disappeared into the night, their work done. Back at home, Alice waited anxiously, her heart leaping when Jim walked through the door, unscathed but exhausted. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he never wanted to let go. "It's over," he whispered, his voice filled with relief. "They won't bother us again." Alice buried her face in his chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Jim had kept his promise, and together they had reclaimed their peace.